Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show with me, Jonathan Steele. When is a job not a job? When is it that work actually does pay? And when does it not? With zero-hour contracts, the controversial employment practice where employees have set employment but no set hours, the definition of what is and what isn't paying work has become hard to define. Last week's finding by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development claimed that more than 1 million people in Britain were now employed under these contracts, refuting the official Office of National Statistic figures of only 250,000. In June, the Business Secretary Vince Cable announced that a review into the use of such contracts was underway. And he said that whilst it's important our workforce remains flexible, it's equally important that it is treated fairly. But if that flexibility does come at the price of stability, do zero-hour contracts have a corrosive effect on services and employment rights? Or are they necessary part of the modern economy, keeping people in work so that they can easier find better work from a place of employment? Well, joining me in the studio to discuss the positive and negative implications of these contracts for those who are on them are Faiza Shaheen, Senior Researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and Charlotte Brouwer, Research Associate from the Adam South Smith Institute. Charlotte Bauer, sorry. Thank you and welcome to the show. Well, let me start with you, Faiza Shaheen. I mean, we now hear that there are 1 million people on these contracts. I mean, it could be even more than that, couldn't it?
Yeah, sure. So actually these results show that we don't really know how many people are on zero-hour contracts. And whereas previously they were in specific sectors, so for instance in hospitality and retail, they've grown. So they've grown across sectors, and they also incorporate professional people as well, and people as well as people on low incomes.
Now, people who defend these contracts sometimes say that some people want that. They want the flexibility. They don't want to work a full week and so on. They've got other commitments and so on. So isn't that a legitimate thing? I mean, how do we know? Let's take it as the 1 million is the figure. Are 90% of the people really pretty unhappy with those contracts, or is it less than that?
Well, I think the problem is actually there's those professionals that are on these contracts that are quite highly paid, and they're generally okay. It's actually the privileged few that are in that situation, or in a situation whereby they have a partner that earns the main income. Actually, for a lot of people, so especially in, take somewhere like the care sectors or single mums or people that are getting by on this money, zero-hour contracts make them highly insecure. It makes it very difficult for them to budget week to week, and it makes them very stressed.
Well, Charlotte Bauer, I mean, do you agree that these contracts are a problem?
Well, I think you've kind of slightly got to put them in perspective. I mean, 1 million people sounds like a lot, and it's obviously a lot of people, but it represents roughly about 3 to 4% of the workforce. And the CIPD study which came out, they when they interviewed people who are on these contracts, there's only 16% of people who were worried and wanted more hours than they had. 38% of people responded saying that they consider themselves in a full-time job with 30 plus hours a week. So there definitely is cause for concern in some areas, but taking it on a sort of a broader spectrum, it does represent perhaps like quite a small proportion of people who are working. So there definitely is cause for concern in some areas, but taking it on a sort of a broader spectrum, it does represent perhaps like quite a small proportion of people who are working who are facing this difficulty. And again, you have the fact that lots of students and lots of people doing part-time work, maybe people who are fitting around childcare, find these flexibilities useful, and maybe it shouldn't be used as a blanket case in lots of situations where it doesn't suit everybody. But I think you can't just say because some people have a negative experience with them that you should outright ban them or.
But aren't a lot of these contracts framed in such a way that you're not allowed to take another job? You've got to be on call all the time, 24/7.
I mean, I would say I have a sort of contention with that issue. I'd say if people are on zero-hour contracts, personally, I'd say they should be able to be on a number of different contracts, because on zero-hour contracts, you're allowed to, your employer is allowed to offer you work when you want, but you're also allowed to turn it down, theoretically, without fear of repercussions. So I would say that people who are on zero-hour contracts should be free to take on other commitments so they can try and mix and match jobs. Some employers have a problem with that, and some employers are fine with it. So I'd say that's a kind of a matter between firms and not necessarily a problem with the contract.
What about people who can they go on job seekers allowance if they turn down a zero-hour contract?
No, the problem with the zero-hour contracts is that you don't know how much you're going to earn, so you can't say have tax credits or help from government. And actually what you could end up happening is that because of the insecurity of this work, that you could be more secure and at least know how much money you're getting if you're on benefits.
Well, what are the unions doing? I mean, these contracts seem to be covering a wide range of employers. I mean, this is classic trade union activity to try and improve health, safety and working conditions and pay for workers. I mean, are the unions doing anything about it?
Absolutely. I mean, the unions are shouting loud about this, but what you have to remember is that union coverage has declined since the 80s, and you can see that they don't have coverage in some of these areas. So where work, for instance, has been outsourced from the public sector, so a lot of, again, care work and retail and hospitality, where there isn't a lot of union coverage. And so it's difficult for them to represent workers. We've been doing some work with a union, and we found that workers who are represented by a union are less likely to be on these types of contracts, or at least have someone to speak out for them.
So in other words, a company that has a good, strong union membership will probably not be using zero-hour contracts.
They may well be, but there will at least be a dialogue there, and there will be something around, how these zero-hour contracts are. Also, people get sickness pay, etc., because often people on zero-hour contracts don't have holiday pay, they don't have sick pay, they don't have maternity pay, so it's insecurity on a number of layers.
When did all this start? I mean, it's suddenly come into the headlines in the last few days. I mean, is this something that's been going on for a number of years, or we just didn't know?
I mean, I think it has been around for a few years. Certainly, it's been around in sort of 2004. There were statistics published, and there has been a very big increase in the last few years since they've done surveys. There's been jumps in quite a few sectors, and again, as Faisal was saying, across a number of different sectors, with this coming up more and more frequently. I mean, what I would kind of imagine is one of the key factors is that during the economic downturn, obviously businesses have to become much more flexible. They've not been able to take on staff. And I think these zero-hour contracts have been a way of maintaining employment and keeping people on board without having to fire them, but to have a sort of a ready, easy workforce which they can pick and choose from. So I would imagine that part of the reason for the rise of this has been sort of an economic downturn, but perhaps as the economy starts to recover, these might become less commonplace as employers are able to take people on a sort of more regular contract things.
No, but it's so much in the benefit of the employers. Why should they, even in a situation of more employment all round, less unemployment, why shouldn't they stick with these contracts? In fact, put more workers onto them?
Well, I mean, there's always the argument that employers who are employed in sort of stable jobs with happy contracts, they're more productive, they're happier people, they're more likely to sort of stay with the company. They've got their own benefits for having a happy, devoted workforce who have actually got an incentive to work with the company. These are obviously things that they can factor in. And perhaps there is sort of pressure, to argue that benefits for having a happy, devoted workforce who have actually got an incentive to work with the company. These are obviously things that they can factor in. And perhaps there is sort of pressure, to argue that people should be treated better on these zero-wage contracts. But I wouldn't say it's totally just in the favour of the employers, these contracts.
Well, what happens to our national insurance contributions? Do these workers pay that?
I believe when they work that they do still have to pay taxes, etc. When they do have they do get hours and they do get their pay packet. I just want to come back on this point, on businesses and the way in which actually the labour market, zero-hour contracts, very much as symbolic of the way that the labour market has shifted in terms of who has got the power, who's in control, and employers increasingly have that control and have that power. And you're right in talking about zero-hour contracts increasing dramatically over the recession. And it's very unlikely that that's going to go back unless employers really buy this argument that their workers are more productive, as the research shows. In fact, we see that employers are moving more in the direction of less legislation, increasing levels of low pay in the labour market. This is a very concerning phenomenon. This isn't just about the recession. This is about an increasingly polarised labour market in which people at the bottom and in the middle are increasingly seeing their incomes and living standards squeezed.
Well, there's a bit of a contradiction here because, I mean, we've had deregulation in the Thatcher years and so on, and it continued actually under New Labour. And then we've had a feeling, as a result of the crash of 2008, that there should have been more regulation in the economy. And this sort of trend of public opinion seems to be saying, yes, there has to be more regulation. And suddenly we find there's massive deregulation going on with these zero-hour contracts. So.
Yeah, so you would have thought that we would have moved towards perhaps more regulation. But actually, this idea of flexible labour markets is very strong amongst policymakers, and this idea that we need to have more flexible labour markets. But actually what that means, what that's really code for, is that flexibility to employers means insecurity often to employees.
And is this becoming a political issue? Has the Labour Party, which seems to be getting its message rather sort of confused and silent almost on many issues, have they started to take this thing up and to criticise this?
Well, I think broadly the issue of squeezed living standards and squeezed incomes is coming up, and I think the message around the living wage, for instance, is a political issue now, and you see people both on the right and left talk about the need for more people to take on the living wage. But I think it needs to be shouted louder about people's jobs, these are people's livelihoods, and people are really struggling. We speak to people talking about how they cannot budget week to week, how they have to give up sugar because they have to live on very minimum standards.
Well, Charlotte, I mean, there is this issue of the statistics about unemployment and so on, and the government claiming that unemployment is coming down and so on, but isn't it that these figures actually disguise what is really underemployment, which for many people is, and for the economy as a whole, is just as bad as unemployment?
I mean, yeah, I'd absolutely say. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that underemployment is a bad thing, and yeah, unemployment figures are coming down. And I wouldn't like to say that, you know, the majority of workers stuck on zero-hour contracts is an ideal situation. I honestly think that's a genuinely good situation where they can be used. But there's also the argument that the use of these zero-hour contracts has helped, even though there's necessarily underemployment, it's halted unemployment quite so much. I think the Institute of Directors argued that without these contracts, it's possible that we would have had sort of up to 3 million unemployment in the peak of the crisis instead of 2.5 million. You've got countries like France and Spain which are hit with very high unemployment, and particularly in sort of like youth unemployment, and they've got very rigid labour laws. People like the IMF are always saying they need to reform and make more flexible. So they might not be the ideal situation, but they could have in certain places helped sort of stave off unemployment a little bit. And so much research and so many studies show that it's better for people to be in employment than it is to fall into unemployment and become long-term unemployed. So even if they're working maybe just a few hours a week, it's better for them and helps them encourage their skills and find other jobs if they're at least working something.
Well, let's come on to the issue of Vince Cable. I mean, I quoted him at the beginning as saying that employers should treat people fairly, even if they want flexibility. I mean, a very good soundbite, but is the government actually doing anything to change the situation, or are they really quite happy with what's been discovered in the last few weeks?
Yeah, well, the really interesting thing is with sort of zero-hour contracts, this sounds like there's something that's a very much of a private sector issue, but it's really not. I mean, out of the people interviewed, 17% of these zero-hour contracts were in private sectors, and I think it was 24% were public sector. There's something that's a very much of a private sector issue, but it's really not. I mean, out of the people interviewed, 17% of these zero-hour contracts were in private sectors, and I think it was 24% were public sectors, and 34% of those were charity sectors. So this isn't simply something that's just a private sector money-saving issue. This is something that affects the whole sort of spectrum of jobs. So if the government wanted to do something about it, there's obviously this big sector of public sector workers, people in councils and stuff, who are hired on these. And I mean, I don't know what their review is going to come up with, but if they wanted to change it, they could set a best precedence perhaps, and either set sort of like, you know, conditions which are on a pay with full-time employers, or they could do away with it and set their own precedents. But I don't think the answer for them would be just to create an outright ban. But there's definitely opportunity for them to do something if they didn't like what they found.
Well, Faiza Sheen, what do you think the government should be doing about it? Should they do anything about it?
Yeah, and I mean, I would definitely agree. So you look at the usage of this contract in the public services, and also we have to remember the public and private sector is not as, the lines are blurred now because of the outsourcing issue. So you will find a lot of people working in the private sector that are delivering public services. So there are ways through commissioning, and sector is not as, the lines are blurred now because of the outsourcing issue. So you will find a lot of people working in the private sector that are delivering public services. So there are ways through commissioning and procurement that government can make a real difference, both in terms of the use of these contracts and in terms of low pay. And they definitely should be taking the first step in doing that, and the best practice, getting their own house in order. These zero-hour contracts and low pay has massive consequences, not only for individuals, but for the wider economy and society. When you think about the cost of stress, when you think about low incomes, and that means low demand within the economy, there is a real need to act.
Well, what about, I mean, Labour as a whole sort of taking the issue up and really calling on the government to do something? I mean, should they be doing that much more?
Yeah, Labour should be doing that, and I think also the unions should be doing that too. I mean, they are shouting loud about this, but people do need to recognise again how important the role of unions is in our economy. And actually, we've seen that as their coverage has declined, we've seen that employees are increasingly at risk, increasingly put in precarious jobs and not good employment. And we do need to balance the situation between employees are increasingly at risk, increasingly put in precarious jobs and not good employment. And we do need to balance the situation between employers and employees, and unions and government are vital to that.
I mean, you mentioned the figure, Charlotte, 34%, I think you said, were in the charity sector, NGOs
Yes.
and so on. I mean, isn't that rather embarrassing, actually, for the charity sector, since, you know, they are supposed to be helping people and non-profit and all the rest of it. If they themselves are actually undermining the rights of the people who work for them, it doesn't set a very good example, does it?
Absolutely, and you know, they will also say that they have found it difficult to get through the recession in terms of cuts, etc., in their funding. But it does cast this ethical question that if you're a charity and you're not treating your workers very well. But again, I would say that some of these charities are delivering public services, so public sector and public sector contracts could have a big influence again on voluntary services.
Yeah, because people aren't going to be willing to give money to charities if they think these charities of themselves, you know, have something to hide.
Yeah, I mean, I think that zero-hour contracts and low pay and this kind of push at the bottom of the labour market is endemic of a wider movement. So it's, you know, zero-hour contracts might not just be prevalent in the private sector, but there is big problems in the private sector in terms of pay. So I think everyone needs to act, but the government actually could do something very big by just taking the first step and doing something through the public sector and public sector contracts.
What about the whole issue of gender inequality? I mean, do we know out of these million people, are an awfully large percentage of them actually women?
I think they tend to be, often because it's in sort of service industries and care industries, that there is this gender difference. And so, yeah, obviously there is perhaps a worry that this creates a problem, you know, with the gender pay gap, simply because of the irregular hours. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
do we know whether are they also young people? I mean, we've heard all about these interns and so on, people working for absolutely nothing at all. Not only zero contract, zero pay.
Yeah, I mean,
is it a high proportion of people who are young as well?
I mean, a lot of the industries which do use them, particularly in the sort of retail sectors, are places like Wetherspoons and McDonald's, Sports Direct, and a lot of these places tend to employ either young people. I mean, a lot of the industries which do use them, particularly in the sort of retail sectors, are places like Wetherspoons and McDonald's, Sports Direct, and a lot of these places tend to employ either young people or part-time students. So I would say that a high proportion of them, I think, probably are young people, but I know personally quite a few of my friends are on zero-hour contracts, and it suits them because they're sort of, you know, doing part-time work or they're studying and they're doing things. But I'm not. I think it's quite a.
I mean, I guess just coming back to that on the issue of gender, we spoke to quite a few women on these contracts in the social care sector, and they spoke of this kind of reversal of this situation in where they can't really be on their own. They have to rely on a partner. And once one woman said to me that it's like we're going back in time when we have to be with a man to get by. And we really have to ask ourselves if we want a labour market that puts people and women in particular in this situation. And I think on the issue of young people, yeah, it may well work, or it may if you're living at home. But I wonder how many parents out there are happy to keep giving their kids money when they don't get any work one week. And you know, this really comes down to the fact. But I wonder how many parents out there are happy to keep giving their kids money when they don't get any work one week. And you know, this really comes down to the fact that, you know, so some of that, the CIPD study did show that some people are getting enough hours a week. But if they are often getting enough hours a week, why don't they have a permanent contract with a number of hours on there? Why do they need to be on zero-hour contracts? So it again comes back to the way that employers are in this position where they can turn off and turn on the work tap as they will, and it leaves people in this insecure position.
Well, it means that they're not committed to having to give holiday pay or sick pay or pension contributions or anything else.
In some cases,
I'm not sure. I think they are. Depending on the hours worked, I think you are entitled to holiday pay. I think if you clock up enough hours, I mean, obviously that's the question. Are you clocking up enough hours
in 1 week or 1 month or something, or what?
I think it's over a period of time. I'm not.
I mean, it's very unclear. So in some cases they will get that coverage, in other cases they won't.
I mean,
well, isn't that an area where there should be some regulation, where the government should say if a person works more than a certain number of hours over 3 months or whatever, they should be entitled to holiday pay, etc.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an argument that you can make and say you can have good zero-hour contracts contracts, and you could have sort of unscrupulous employers who are, taking advantage of people and sort of, using them as a work tap in order to keep, full-time employment down. But places like the National Trust, they have come out and they've said, yes, we use zero-hour contracts. We use it because our employment is incredibly seasonal. We, depending on the weather, like their sort of capacity and how many people come to visit them is incredibly variable. And they say we give everyone who works on zero-hour contracts the same rights as we do for our full-time staff. It's just they're on zero-hour contracts because we don't always need all of these people. There's definitely ways of working within zero-hour contracts where you could make them perhaps more palatable to most people's conceptions without doing away with them completely or totally demonising them, I think.
What does Buckingham Palace say?
Oh, I don't know, actually. I haven't checked that out.
Do you know?
No, they use quite a few.
How have they defended it?
I don't know, actually. I don't know about what Buckingham Palace is saying in particular. Yeah, I guess on this point of bad zero-hour contracts versus good zero-hour contracts, there are some practices that are not as bad. And banning them outright, they have done that in I think it's in the Netherlands that they've done that, and they ban them outright, and then employers try to get around that by having an annual 20-hour contract. So, this has to come in hand with unions, collective bargaining structure, so that this isn't just a one-off way in which employers can eventually get their way around. You have to remember that zero-hour contracts grew out of the fact that European law told us that people on temporary contracts had to have sick pay, etc. So as a way to get around that, people took on zero-hour contracts. So we have to think here about how we can have a sustained change in the labour market so employees are protected.
But do we know enough about what's happening in other EU countries? I mean, does Britain employ a larger percentage of the workforce in these contracts than other countries, or don't we?
Yeah, we do have a higher amount of people on low pay, a higher amount of people on zero-hour contracts. I mean, coming back on the point on Spain and other countries where there's been high levels of unemployment, they do also have these types of contracts. And I think it's very easy to conflate the issue. Their issue is less about flexible labour markets and more about their economy and sectors and their currency, which is a problem right now. You cannot blame their problem solely on not having flexible labour markets.
Well, there's also the wages issue. I mean, the figures came out very recently showing that Britain is the biggest drop over the last 3 years in standard of living and wages for most people, taking account of inflation, is in Britain. And, well, I think Spain and Greece may be worse, but France and Germany are much, much better than we are.
Yeah, I mean, a drop in living standards of the kind that we've seen, so people's income is roughly about 2006 level right now, hasn't happened for over a century. And we really have to wonder who the economy is working for when so many people are not gaining.
Well, what's your answer to that? Who is the economy working for?
It's a big question. Yeah, I don't think there's any sort of particular magic bullet. And I would say definitely there's been some sectors which have definitely benefited at the expense of the economy. You see bankers and people on high bonuses getting bailed out, and they seem to have not had the repercussions for their actions. And they're definitely, we have gone back to a point where our standards of living are as high again. But it's a difficult question to say, OK, fine, that's a problem, but how do we make this better? We can't just suddenly say we're going to pay everyone, £1,000 a week and everything will work. You've got to look at how to sort of get the economy being dynamic and growing again, and whether that comes with more sort of supply side answers. A lot of people would argue that loosening up the regulation in the labour market would be a good way to start getting people to work again.
We're running right out of time. That's a big question, but clearly something has to be done about the economy, and we'll be discussing it many times, I'm sure, in the future. Thank you very much, Faiza Shaheen and Shahdat Baya. Thank you. And thank you for watching.